Number one, true or false? Getting booed at home actually helped Spencer Rattler prepare for playing on the road.
I don't know that it helped him prepare, so I'm going to go for false with this one. I do think it set him on a course to prove his doubters wrong, though, and to continue at the level of efficiency that we've talked about. When we look at Spencer Rattler and we look, and I said that there was a potential turning point when we kind of recapped the West Virginia. We didn't recap. You recapped the West Virginia game. So in the preview then for this game, I was saying I could see that as a turning point for him, simply because of what we saw Lincoln Riley do with Spencer Rattler while they were playing Texas last year. Again, my answer is false for this one, but I do think it changed his trajectory, and I think it changed the mindset that he had in going into this game, is that he was going to lean into the talents that he has, lean into the skill set that he possesses, and instead of trying to force some of the issues, instead of trying to make those big plays, just continue to play the efficient level of football that moves the chains and scores on nearly every possession in the game against Kansas State, and instead turn those doubters into supporters. That's what I think it did for him.
Okay, so I'm gonna preface my my thoughts on this by saying that I'm really disappointed. Maybe it happened and I didn't hear it. I'm really disappointed in the Kansas State student section and fan base because the opportunity was absolutely missed. If you want to get in Spencer Rattler's head on the road, you start chanting, "We want Caleb." You know, that has to be somewhere. Some student section's got to pick up on that. And the student section for Kansas State right behind the Oklahoma bench. And I just really disappointed that I never heard that on Saturday. That said, I say this is true because you go on the road and you expect to hear nasty things. You expect to be booed. You expect the crowd to taunt you. You don't expect that at home. And that's probably more demeaning to him in his own place than it is on the road. And so I think it just kind of hardens him even that much more to any type of criticism that he may face on the road. But regardless, you're absolutely spot on and true with your assessment of that. He is better for it. And I just think that it probably helped in a different way than what you're saying. But again, we can agree to disagree. Let's move on to number two. And I'm going to set you up because this is this is a setup question. Okay. Just be forewarned. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right. If OU plays the way they played Saturday against Kansas State, then they'll get beat next week.
No. That one's false for me, Matt. I think there are obviously things for Oklahoma to improve upon, and that's for both sides, all three sides of the ball, if we want to go that far, but more particularly on both sides of the ball. I look at this defense and I look at the lack of depth in the secondary, but I know that the strength and the heart of this defense has really been the defensive line and the front seven as a whole. And what Texas is bringing to town is going to be a heavy dose of the running attack through their running back, Robinson, who's been basically an all-world running back up to this point. Sure, Texas has suffered a loss already coming into this game, but it doesn't make him any less dangerous of a ball carrier. In fact, he may be the best running back in the conference, and this is a conference that has Breece Hall in it still. Bijan Robinson is out to prove that he is primed not only for a big year, but worthy of the consideration of the Heisman Trophy at the end of the year for this Texas program. I think, again, with this front seven, they're going to carry a majority of the responsibility, and then the secondary is going to be in place in order to limit any damage. But all that responsibility is going to go up front. Offensive line, we've already talked about, and limiting some of the mental mistakes. With a 50-50 split in a stadium, it's going to be very interesting to see how that group responds, how some of these transfers that are cementing themselves in this equation at the offensive line respond to being in that scenario, because it is so unique. You don't get to play in a venue like that. You don't get to play with two fan bases on opposite ends of the field and opposite end zones like that ever, at least to my knowledge, even in a bowl game. So how will they adjust? What will the mental mistakes be? Again, there are some improvements, but you look at just what Oklahoma did and how capable they were. The only complaint, which we'll get to on the defensive side of the ball for me, was when Oklahoma opened up gigantic zones for Deuce Vaughn to sit in, which were 7 to 10 yards downfield. We know how dangerous he is after he receives that pass from whoever it is, Will Howard or Skylar Thompson. We've seen how dangerous he can be, and not to have a player in the vicinity, a defender in the vicinity of him, was very jarring for me because we knew he would be the focal point. Obviously, you wanted to limit what he was doing when he was rushing the ball. 51 yards rushing, 104 receiving, though. Leading the Kansas State Wildcats in receiving yards. That's something that I do think if Oklahoma can't fix against a guy like Robinson, they'll be in for a world of hurt. But I'm not too concerned about that, because if Oklahoma plays, getting back to your question, if Oklahoma plays like they did this weekend, they'll still beat Texas.
So again, I'm going to preface what I'm about to say with this because it's going to reiterate your point. I watched every second of that Texas TCU game, and I'm just going to say Casey Thompson did not look spectacular under the pressure that the TCU defensive front brought against him. And so if you're an Oklahoma fan, you start right there. This Texas offense, you pressure Casey Thompson on obvious passing downs and looked a little bit rattled. Secondly, again, that was a loaded question. I'm probably alienating some of the Oklahoma fan base, but I've seen that on social media, Rich. I've seen it after Tulane. We play this way against Nebraska, we're going to get beat. I saw it after Nebraska. We play this way against West Virginia, we're going to get beat. Saw it after West Virginia. We play this way against Kansas State, we're going to get beat. And guess what? Still seeing it. 5-0 is still seeing we play this way next week, we're going to get beat. So I just want to throw that out there to see, because I strongly disagree with that. I'm on your side of this. We're going to agree on this. There are things to improve. There are going to be things to improve every week. But at this point, I think you got to, at some point, it's like me in Oklahoma State, right? At some point, you just got to stop and say, okay, it is what it is. They find a way to win. And winning ugly is definitely better than losing pretty, right?
And we've said that that's a mark of a good team. Like
Absolutely,
I said, man,
yeah.
I'll never understand why that applies to other teams. But when Oklahoma Sooners fans just spit everywhere, my apologies if you saw that on a video, Matt. But Oklahoma fans will apply that to other teams and saying good teams just find a way to win. But when it comes to your own program, it's like that statement doesn't apply. If Oklahoma is finding a way to win, we should inherently say that they are a good football team. Are they a national championship caliber football team? That's a different conversation. But this is a good football team that at this point in time is undefeated and doesn't look like, no matter how close you can come to them, Oklahoma is still going to have a chance to be in the driver's seat of this game and win it, even if it requires a field goal as the time expires.
No, and that's a very, very solid point. I think the only way you could apply that statement, if Oklahoma plays this way next week, they'll get beat, is if next week is Alabama. I think that's the only way you can really apply that statement at this point.
What about Georgia?
I think Alabama's the better of the two, but we can throw Georgia in there. I wouldn't feel real confident right now with Oklahoma going up against Georgia next Saturday either. Okay, so let's move on to number 3, and I'm probably going to say less now for 3, 4, and 5. Not saying I won't say anything, but I'll probably say less and leave these totally up to you. So number 3, we've seen Jaden Hazelwood lead the team in receptions. We've seen Marvin Mims. We've seen Mike Woods. True or false? Oklahoma doesn't have a go-to guy at receiver right now.
I think that's false. I think the number one target is Marvin Mims, but the defenses are keying in on him, really limiting what Marvin Mims, the maneuverability that he has in the open green of the grass that he has to run in. They're shading players over the top. Rotations are consistently moving in his direction, and he seems to be the first read, if not the first read, the second read on a lot of these plays as they begin to develop. He's just not open, and I think that'll come with experience for him. It's easy to forget after the season that he had that he's a true sophomore this season. technically could still be a freshman because they were granted the additional year of eligibility. But when we look at Marvin Mims and we look at what he was capable of, again, I believe it's easy to overlook that fact about him. He's still an underclassman. He's still gaining experience. He's still developing into the player that he will become. But at the end of the day, Marvin Mims has always been the number one target on this current roster for me. And then you've got the complementary pieces, the Mario Williams, who's coming along, progressing nicely, the Jaden Hazelwood, who seems to be the number one option in the red zone, but can absolutely deliver when the moment calls for it. You've got those three players. I think Theo Weiss being available would change that equation quite significantly for me. And I may not have said false, that there's not a number one receiver, but without Theo Weiss on the field, without his availability, again, it's undoubtedly to me Marvin Mims.
Okay, I just going to point out that nine players caught passes on Saturday against Kansas State.
Mm-hmm.
All 5 games this season, Oklahoma has had at least 9 players catch a pass. And while I don't disagree with what you're saying, I do think it speaks to the fact that Oklahoma does have playmakers. And so one week it may have to be Jaden Hazelwood. One week it may have to be Michael Woods. One week it could be Marvin Mims like it was Saturday.
I will say this, is that it doesn't seem as though the chemistry is completely solidified between the quarterback, Spencer Rattler, and some of these receivers. We can talk about there's 2 specific throws. One of them is the interception, severely underthrown. But when you look at where Mario Williams is on that play, despite the ball being underthrown, he's already beaten his defender. The safety's coming over to try to save the cornerback in that situation. And I think if Spencer Rattler, who does have the talent to do this, does have the ability, if he's able to throw it in that gap, it's a big time play. Oklahoma scores on that drive, and we're not even having this conversation about the kickoff anymore. Needless to say, that was one example. The second example, Mario Williams, once again, who has beaten his receiver, but I know what the route was, and it was going to be a curl, an out route, something towards the sideline, because that's where Spencer Rattler throws the ball. There's not that chemistry where instead he throws it downfield. And the last time that I've seen that in person, I've got to go way back for that kind of chemistry that I've seen in person. And that was Jason White and Will Peoples, I believe it was, in the national championship game against USC, the Orange Bowl.
Mark Bradley. Get away from that punt, Mark Bradley. Don't touch that punt, Mark Bradley. Sorry, I still have nightmares about that moment. Okay, so
I'm just saying that's a play that breaks off.
Yeah.
And because of the experience of the quarterback, because of the experience of the receiver, you're able to just throw the ball downfield and let the receiver get it. I don't feel as though Spencer Rattler and obviously these young receivers like Mario Williams are there yet. They're just not on the same page 100%.
All right, fair enough. Number 4, true or false? Kansas State did everything necessary to beat Oklahoma in the first half. They held the Sooners to field goals in 2 of their 3 offensive possessions. They chewed up the clock. They moved the ball themselves. They did everything. They did the blueprint. They followed it to a T. So here's the question. Here's the statement. True or false? The fact that Kansas State did everything necessary to beat Oklahoma in the first half, but yet still trailed going into the locker room is a huge takeaway for this Oklahoma football team on Saturday in general, because we all know about the momentum shift in the second half. We know we've already talked about Oklahoma getting the ball to start the second half and really putting the pressure on Kansas State. All that's set up by the fact that Kansas State literally threw everything at Oklahoma, everything that they had, and they still trailed, and Oklahoma was immediately able to make it a 2-score game in the third quarter. So true or false? The fact that Oklahoma was able to withstand that and go into the halftime with a lead is one of the biggest takeaways you can get from this trip to Manhattan.
I do have to say that one's true. When we look at the blueprint that was laid, it really comes down to the number of offensive possessions. Sure, all the other stuff is like icing on the cake. It's not the cake. It was limiting the number of offensive possessions. And when you're able to do that to 3 and you as the Oklahoma Sooners opponent score twice yourself, it's putting a lot of pressure on this team to deliver, to speed things up, to maybe hit a little bit of the panic button and start to force the issue, which does typically result in turnovers for the opposing defense. So when we look at what Kansas State was doing schematically, when we look at the game plan that they came in with, I think they executed it perfectly in the first half. And like you said, Matt, yes, this one's true. The fact that Oklahoma was leading, it should put all these other teams that are still on the schedule on notice.
Okay, last question, true or false? Despite the penalties, Tyrese Robinson has been Oklahoma's best offensive lineman this season.
It's a good question, if we're being honest.
Because
I love Marquise Hayes. And I love the potential that exists in him, but we've been looking for a leader on this offensive line, which is why I have to answer your question with true. When Creed Humphrey stepped off of this roster and in to the NFL, he left this huge void, these big shoes to fill. And the question was, who is actually going to fill them? And Matt, I think in our preseason talks, it wasn't anything that the national media was talking about. It was something that you and I had brought up because of what Creed Humphrey meant to not just this offensive line, but the team as a whole. So who was going to step up and who was going to fill that role was the big question mark. Tyrese Robinson is the closest thing to replacing the attitude and the mentality and the physicality that Creed Humphrey exemplified on the field. When he begins to embrace that role on this team, I think you're going to see a completely different offensive line. We've seen him take that step forward. Yes, true. He's the best offensive lineman on this team through 5 games of the season. But if he continues to embrace that role, if he continues to assume that responsibility, I do expect this offensive line to quickly become much better than they were.